Awesome. All right. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining Artifact's Impact by Design webinar today. If you've attended one before, welcome back. If this is your first one, Impact by Design is a series that we host to bring community together, a community of like-minded folks with a common goal to making positive change through strategy and design. And so today we're going to be talking about Futures Literacy 101, using strategic foresight to fuel creativity and to design responsibly. So some housekeeping before we dive in. Today's webinar is interactive and we will be utilizing polls and the chat feature for that. So if you feel comfortable, please participate. Once again, for the chat feature, make sure that you're sharing your message to panelists and attendees so that everyone can see your participation. There will also be time for questions at the end, but if during the webinar you have questions, please use the Q&A feature in Zoom so that we can track questions separately from activity participation to cause a little bit less confusion. So those are two separate buttons to utilize there. So our goal for this webinar is to introduce the basics of how to use strategic foresight. This is just the tip of the iceberg, with futures work being a really large domain of expertise. But we wanted to provide the starting point with this workshop and actionable toolkit. You will be able to get your hands on these materials that we're walking through today after the webinar, so you can use them yourself. We'll also be recording today's session and you'll have access to that as well. If you do end up using these tools in the future, please let us know, tag us on social media at Artifact Group. We'd love to see it. And we hope this is a really fun, engaging, and interactive introduction to futures literacy. So, all right, now for some introductions. So I've been talking for the past 5 minutes. Who am I? Hello, everyone. My name is Andrea Kang. I'm a senior interaction designer at Artifact, working at the intersection of design and strategy, working on design envisioning and research projects to help guide clients towards purposeful outcomes and futures. So if you don't know Artifact, Artifact is a strategy and design firm based in Seattle, Washington. We are guided by our philosophy of responsible design, using strategy and human-centered design to achieve positive long-term outcomes like a more equitable and sustainable future. So now I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, John, to introduce himself, as well as to allow him to take it away as he guides us through the rest of this webinar. Thanks, everyone, for joining.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to our webinar today. We're so happy you're here. I'm John Rousseau. I'm a partner at Artifact and lead our efforts in strategic foresight, as well as a lot of our work in emerging technology. My work over the past decade or so is focused on the intersection of human-centered design and futures. I've worked on things like the future of sustainability, mobility, future of work, and many other topics. I'm really excited to bring to you today just the kind of foundation of futures thinking, which I believe is an important skill set for all strategists and designers, and really anyone who cares about creating a better world. So we're going to introduce you today to the kind of foundational toolkit of futures thinking, and hopefully give you just enough that you can kind of get going and engage in some futures work on your own. Okay, so I'm going to walk through a little bit of a prelude, and then we'll get into some live activities in just a minute. So to start, you might be asking, well, why foresight? There are lots of reasons why foresight is, I think, gaining traction in the marketplace and becoming an important topic for leaders and practitioners of all types. And these are just 4 kind of top-level reasons. The first is that it's become almost cliche to acknowledge that we're in a place of accelerating change and high uncertainty. I think we're all familiar with the change bit. It's easy to forget, for example, that not too long ago there was no such thing as an iPhone. Not too long before that, there was really no such thing as a laptop computer, and so on and so forth. So we live in a world of rapid and continuous change, driven in large part by emerging technology. Simultaneously, we live in a world of high uncertainty. So something like the COVID pandemic has changed all kinds of things like how we work, how we interact with one another, and how we engage in our day-to-day lives. All of that creates an environment where thinking about the future and doing so in a structured way can help us be better strategists, better designers, better business people, better citizens. The second reason is that it allows us to think proactively about how we solve some of our most difficult and wicked problems. We live in a world where we have a climate emergency, we have geopolitical threats, we have cyber threats. There are a lot of things to worry about. And rather than just sit around and worry about these things, it's far better to use the tools of foresight to think about what we might do about them and to work toward creating a better future. That leads into point number 3, which is really taking collective responsibility for positive outcomes. No matter who you are, what your role is, what kind of work you do, we're all in some way responsible for creating our shared future. And so having a futures lens allows us to think critically about that future, as well as identify kind of places where we can contribute to the future that we want. And then the reason that we're all here is because futures tools are just fun. They allow us to think creatively, and they allow us to, as teams and as leaders, make more informed decisions about what it is that we do next. So there are some basic concepts that I think are important to get out of the way. The first is that there are no facts or data about the future. Like, this is absolutely true, and I will stand by it. So what futurists do is they extrapolate from historical patterns and a broad analysis of emerging change. So the only thing we can do as humans is look backward and think about what's happened and what that means for where things are going. And we can look at what is happening in terms of what's emerging, what are early signals of change, and think about what all of that means for where we're going, knowing that we have the ability to shape that, right? That we live in this world of flux where things are changing both outside of our control, but also within our control. So as a futurist, I might forecast or envision potential outcomes, but it's important to note that we don't make predictions. There are an infinite number of possible futures. And again, if COVID has proven anything to us, it's that unexpected large-scale events do happen, and they change the world in fundamental and profound ways. So nothing is really certain, no matter what it is. Our job is to think about kind of what that means and square that up with what kind of world we want to make. Number 3 is that change is systemic. So everything is connected. So today we're going to be talking about a very finite and fixed and easily accessible problem space. But what you'll see is that problem space is connected to a lot of other problems, right? It's connected to a lot of other kind of phenomena in the world, all of which are interacting to kind of create the world in which we live. So thinking in terms of systems is incredibly important. And then finally, futures thinking is ongoing. So it's not something we do once in a workshop and then we're done. It's something that we need to continue doing kind of forever, because we're living in a period of change, right? There's no getting around change as a fundamental constant. And so our job is really to pay attention to change and to update our models as we go. So to update the assumptions we have about the future, to update kind of our responses to the outcomes we are working toward, and to continually tune our approach in order to achieve those outcomes. Okay, so here's what we're going to do today. We've put together this kind of quick set of modules that will allow you to kind of work within the construct of creating futures. And this workshop is tailored toward largely design and innovation teams. So whether you work in a consultancy or you work in a corporation, or perhaps you work in government or some other kind of organization, if you're trying to do something new and you're trying to think about how to change something for the better in the future, these tools are for you. So the modules we're going to talk about today include how to kind of think about and scan for change in the environment, how to explore the impacts of change using a tool called Futures Wheels, building basic scenarios or stories about the future, and then thinking about how all of these things kind of come together to impact stakeholders. One thing I want to note is that this work is built on the work of many others, and in particular, Jerome Glenn, who's a futurist who invented the Futures Wheel tool, and Wendy Schultz, who invented the Manoa strategy for building scenarios. We're going to be using both of those methods today. And if you want to know more about them, you can kind of Google either of those people and find loads of stuff on the internet. So let's talk about what we're going to talk about today. So the first thing you need to do when you're beginning a futures project is, it may seem obvious, but you need to figure out what it is that you're going to focus on. What is the focal question that you're going to explore, and what is the problem space in which you're going to explore it. So for us today, I'm just going to kind of do this live to make it extra exciting. We're going to work on the future of grocery. The future of grocery is obviously something that is broadly accessible to everyone who's on this call today. We all have to acquire food, and so grocery seems like a good place to start. Also understanding that food is such an important part of kind of how we live both today and in the future. Secondly, we need to think about the time frame. Futurists work on many different time frames: 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, or more. So for today, we're going to go 10 years in the future. And so we're going to look at the future of grocery 10 years from today in 2031. And the mind space that we want to be in is what's written below. I have to imagine that we're working on behalf of a national food retailer. They're working on an innovation program to think about how to use emerging tech to better serve customers and address issues like access to healthy and affordable food. They also, because they're a business, want to make sure that they are successful in the future that they live in. And so hedging bets and thinking about how risk impacts their business is an important part of what they are concerned with. So this team wants to ensure that the vision they're creating is both creative by challenging their assumptions about the future, as well as responsible in terms of how they think about looking out for stakeholders. So with that, we'll look at now kind of the core modules. We're working on the future of grocery. We need to think about how we're going to identify change happening in the environment and what changes in particular we want to work with in our workshop today. So the first topic today that I want to talk about in terms of tools, if I can get my zoom to the right level, is what's called horizon scanning. So horizon scanning to a futurist is really kind of the bulk of what they do every day. It's really looking at the world very, very broadly across the entire domain of human activity and looking for signals of change. So horizon scanning is really taking a holistic and systemic approach to monitoring change. So even though I just said, well, we're talking about grocery today, right? We're talking about food. You'll notice that the signals of change that we've pre-populated in the little circles below are things like income inequality or AI or the gig economy or pandemics. None of these are directly related to the topic of grocery, but all of them are adjacent to this problem space. So it gets back to what I was saying about change being systemic and all aspects of a system essentially putting pressure on or affecting things like the future of grocery. So all of these changes are things that would apply to, say, a wide variety of business conditions, but in particular, they're all adjacent to grocery in, I think, interesting ways. That's the second thing about horizon scanning, is we want to make sure that the changes we identify that we're paying attention to are outside of our kind of core domain, but also not so far outside that they are irrelevant. So when we're scanning for change, we're looking for change that is adjacent to the problem space in which we are working. It's also important to consider both weak signals and known trends. So you'll notice that we have everything from alternative protein sources. That's probably a pretty weak signal if you've been following some of the news about synthetic meat in production most recently, as well as things that are familiar to everybody, like climate disasters. Right, so we need to look at both the things that are emerging as well as those things that are just of critical importance, but that have a high degree of uncertainty. And the way we do that is by using a framework called STEEP. And so STEEP, S-T-E-E-P, stands for social, technological, economic, environmental, and political. Now, there are a lot of different ways of kind of using frameworks like this, and there are alternative frameworks as well. The basic idea is that by having a framework like that, if we're looking for change across all of these different dimensions of what's happening in the world, it ensures that we're not, for instance, just looking at technology. If we're thinking about our grocery innovation team, you may remember that I said they're focused on thinking about how technology can help them solve certain problems. This is a common way to think about kind of solving things. What kind of innovation is happening and how can we use that innovation to do things in the world? But that's thinking in a really narrow way, and it's not really considering, say, the breadth of change that is existing adjacent to, say, tech as a category. So if we're looking at change across all of the steep categories, it keeps us honest, and it makes sure that we're thinking about change in a truly diverse way. And one more thing about change is that it's important to think about both positive and negative. So some changes that we might be thinking of are inherently negative, something like climate disaster or a pandemic. Others are neutral, like something like a technology like artificial intelligence could have both positive and negative impacts, or something that's inherently positive like conscientious consumerism, which probably has more upside than it has downside. So as you create change, or as you think about creating signals of change for your workshop, it's important to collect a whole bunch of these, many more than what we're showing on the screen, to think about both positive, negative, and neutral changes and to organize those according to the STEEP framework. So because we didn't have time to sort of discuss all of these with you as we would live, we're going to pick just a couple to work with in a second once I talk about the next tool and we figure out where our starting point is going to be. Okay, we're almost there. We're almost ready to start doing stuff, I promise. The main tool that we're going to use today is called a futures wheel. And as I mentioned at the outset, it was invented by a futurist named Jerome Glenn. Futures wheel, even though these don't look like wheels, the original instance of them, they were actually drawn like wheels, and you would put a change in the center and you would essentially radiate out from that change, kind of in a mind map sort of form, where you would go from the first order impact to the second order impact to the third order impact of that change, and so on and so forth. I've chosen to use the mind map kind of widget within Miro because it kind of automates that process really cleanly, and it allows us to kind of create futures wheels that aren't really wheels, but cascades, in a way that's super easy and highly collaborative. The great thing about futures wheels is that it allows us to work really quickly. I'm being told to zoom in, so I will zoom in. It allows us to work really quickly and to work collaboratively. So futures wheels are really best done collaboratively as a team. They're meant to be done, as I said, quickly, and they're meant to be done without a high degree of seriousness, because what we're doing is we're trying to get to really just a broad range of impacts as quickly as we can, and in a way that is kind of thorough, but not necessarily the product of super rigorous analysis. The good thing about this process is that it allows us as a group to make our assumptions explicit and inspires discourse and alignment. So if I was to say, well, what might happen if single-payer healthcare in the US occurs in 2031? Well, one person might say, well, the world might shift to focus on preventative wellness, and that might create digital incentive systems that then create platforms of diet and exercise monitoring. And I might say, that's interesting. I think that could create a world where people start gaming that system in order to kind of accomplish their own ends. By having that conversation as a team, it allows us to talk about the externalities or the impacts of these changes kind of far removed from the actual change itself. And it allows us to have often a really powerful and clarifying conversation about not only what we mean, but where we're coming from. And then finally, these things are just fun. They inspire creative thinking, and by surfacing externalities or the impacts of all of these changes, it allows us to kind of make those things very tangible for participants and something that we can then kind of work with. So how it works. So we take a change, like in this case, I chose single-payer healthcare in the US. We phrase it as something that has happened, right, in a potential future within the time period that we're working within. And then we explore the impacts of that kind of as we go, right? So now we're gonna practice this. You'll also note that throughout these slides, we have these little kind of blue widgets in the corner that say advice for teams. I'm not going to go through that content today, but when you have access to this board and these materials later, those are some more step-by-step instructions that tell you how to do this and kind of how to think about applying this work in your own context. Okay, so that's the prelude. That's the didactic part of what we're going to do today. Now we're going to get into the fun part. So we're going to pick 2 changes to work with, and these were derived from that list I showed you earlier. We're going to work within the future of grocery space, as I said, and we're going to pick 2 adjacent changes to work with. So option 1 is a pairing of conscientious consumerism. That's kind of people making more moral or ethical decisions about the products they engage with, along with AI and automation. Option 2, increasing societal polarization combined with alternative protein sources. That's the lab-grown meat stuff. Option 3, income inequality and the circular economy. So we're going to, and we'll see if this works, we're going to do a poll. Look at that, it's working. So you should see a poll on your screen. I'd like you to take just 1 quick minute, pick option 1, option 2, or option 3. We'll go from there.
Option you pick will determine the rest of this webinar. All right, so we got a question about what is circular economy. So circular economy is a model of sort of reuse and living in a zero waste society. So hopefully that helps narrow down what that choice means. All right.
Yeah, I also got a question about how do you decide which changes to explore in the future's real with clients so you don't end up boiling the ocean. It's a great question. I would say hold on to those questions. We're going to have time at the end of the webinar to come back and address them. So either put them in the Q&A as you are, and we'll come back to them, or just kind of hold it, and we'll be back with 15 or 20 minutes at the end to dive into this. Okay, so what's the winner of our poll?
Let's see. All right, looks like. All right, Jasmine, our end, I think, is the one owning the poll. So Jasmine, you could potentially let us know once you close that poll, the answers are. All right, so it looks like folks picked option 1. That was the majority here. So conscientious consumers and AI and automation.
Okay, so I'm going to put those in our wheels over here. Let's see how good I type live and quickly. Okay, so we're going to start with these changes then, and we're going to think about 10 years out in a world where conscientious consumerism becomes increasingly the way we think about how we engage with products and services. What is that world like? So like what happens in a world where there's conscientious consumerism? Andrea, do you want to get us started by just kind of shouting something out?
Yeah, for sure. So if I think about the future of conscientious consumerism, I think about something like CSR, or corporate social responsibility, being factored into a brand. It's not just about sort of the name, but it's about what does that company stand for.
Right.
So if folks want to contribute, please do use the chat feature. Be sure to message all panelists and attendees. We're going to be reserving the Q&A section for just questions. So I see that Melissa mentioned that people will stop shopping at Amazon as an example. So as we go through this exercise and the rest of the exercise, this is how we'll sort of be asking for your participation. And so I'll just sort of be asking John to populate things that y'all populate into the chat. So that's kind of how this collaboration is going to go. All right, yeah. So we also had an example of mass customization. I think that's really interesting. Someone also mentioned shifting to local sourcing and having more of a local brand or story. I think something about localization is super interesting. We also have carbon footprint of the product being part of buying decision-making. Someone also mentioned, yeah, relationships, building stronger relationships between consumers and sellers. We have someone talking about fair labor rights, more product transparency into the full sort of life cycle of a product. People thinking about materials, thinking about the materials that's being used, sourcing those materials, using more raw materials. That's a good example. Someone also mentioned sharing of resources. Someone also mentioned world domination. So that's, you know, that's also nice. Someone also mentioned education for consumers. I think that can maybe tie into transparency a little bit. Honest brand value proposition. I think that's interesting. Maybe more on the communication that brands have with their customers. Someone did also mention sort of the reuse and refurbished market. All right, more bulk buying solutions or retailers, maybe for a more efficient supply chain. And just like that, we filled out first order changes at least.
Okay, so let's think about some second order changes. So that was pretty quick. Now, based on these things, so if people stop shopping at Amazon, like what happens next?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think, yeah, more maybe like power to individual artisans or individual creators and makers.
So maybe it's like a small business boom.
Yeah.
Okay. What else?
Stop shopping on Amazon.
Mass prices go up.
That's a valid point.
Yeah. So I think that's an important point that, you know, both positive and negative things happen, even, you know, when changes are on the surface kind of positive. What about mass customization? Any thoughts about what happens after we have mass customization?
Reduced access is an interesting point. Difficult to resell things for mass customization. That's interesting. Kind of creates a different type of life cycle.
So it works against the...
Yeah, higher prices because it's customized. Someone mentioned tools, like maybe accessibility to tools like 3D printing as a way of customizing. So mass customization, someone asked to clarify what that meant. From my perspective, based on the person who contributed that comment, I think it's the idea that things are customized at scale. So individuals can sort of have that onus over the process of customizing the product for them, as far as sort of being more conscientious of their consumption. It's something that's made for them. And so being able to roll that out at scale instead of sort of one-off as it currently exists today.
Let's, where should we put this idea of like artisan goods and your local sourcing?
Yeah, I think local sourcing makes sense.
Let's do buying less. So what happens if people start buying less? It's not really about having better products. They just stop buying stuff. Like what happens then?
Yeah. Economy collapses. Yeah, I mean, viable. Obviously not a preferred outcome, but it's possible. Reduced waste, I think, is a pretty clear example of how that would play out.
Yeah.
Arts and crafts culture rise. More trades work. Been seeing a lot of things about repair culture, sort of being able to repair things yourself. So maybe that plays into DIY there. Recycling and reuse. Yeah, more emphasis on just parts instead of sourcing out an entire new good. Interesting. Well, something that's interesting. We had more time into decision making. So more, more conscientious choice, perhaps. All right, what about materials innovation, folks? What's the second order change from that? Modularization is a great one. I know someone had mentioned here, obviously buying more raw materials. Research innovation, yeah, that's great. Sustainability obviously is a huge factor into that. Yeah. New types of organic matter. Yeah, I think that kind of goes into the innovation here. Just new types of materials, biodegradable materials.
Yeah, that's great. Let's scroll back up. Maybe do some third orders on this economic collapse and less waste and the buying less thread.
Yeah, for sure. Third order change for less waste is, yeah, maybe less landfills, more green spaces.
Okay.
Someone said economic collapse could lead to larger disparity between the rich and the poor, so income inequality. Less waste, less guilt, someone mentioned. So more of that sort of emotional connection. Oh, DIY, someone mentioned more homesteading. That's interesting, sort of that everything off the land mentality. DIY, yeah, new hobbies, new skills. It's great.
I like that. You guys are really good at this. So I might just note like how much we've done in about 10 minutes. So we've kind of exceeded the amount of physical space on our canvas, which is not surprising. But I want to point out just the degree to which we've, like in a very short amount of time, like landed on a bunch of kind of interesting things. So everything from like homesteading to green space to disparities to the demise of Amazon, which everyone seems to be rooting for, no matter what workshop I'm in. That's pretty interesting, right? Which is exactly what the method is supposed to produce. It's supposed to produce a lot of inputs really, really quickly. So before we finish up this wheel, anything that's missing that you all would like to add?
Something about self-sustainability, self-reliance.
Okay, got that.
Stronger communities. Interesting. Maybe from local sourcing. More education for consumers. Awareness. People would need to be willing to make these shifts. That is true. It's not just going to happen overnight. Valid. Fulfillment through creativity and self-exploration. So maybe some more self-actualization through these processes.
All right, great. That was a lot of work for 10 minutes. So if you were doing this in a real workshop, if you will, with a team, you'd spend a little bit more time. So I'd make a bigger canvas. I'd spend a little bit more time, maybe 2 or 3 times as much time, so that you can really kind of flesh this out. But it's a good example of how you can get really far really fast. And again, having more minds kind of collaborating makes this not only fun, but kind of super productive. So I think that was a great start. We're now going to do the same thing again. This time, the second half of that pairing, get ready to think about AI and automation. So as I said before, obviously AI and automation can have a range of both positive and negative outcomes. And so for this particular wheel, I would challenge us to have a mix. So 50% positive, 50% negative. So I'm going to try to put the positive first orders on the top and the negative ones on the bottom. So let's think about the positive side of AI and automation first.
All right, a positive I could see, yeah, freedom from drudgery. That makes sense. Yeah, saving us time, I think being able to be more efficient, finding more efficient solutions. Yeah, I think a lot about time has been coming up, less mistakes. It's true, it's a system that can be taught and built. Great for people who have disabilities was mentioned. Yeah, better accessibility through that makes sense. Thanks for that. Reduced decision fatigue, right? You can just have an algorithm make that decision for you. More availability, maybe more accessibility. Right, it's about halfway there.
Yeah, I was going to put I'm going to put job growth up here under freedom from drudgery.
Yeah, seems fitting.
Okay, so the moment you've all been waiting for, like the dystopian side of AI and automation. So,
all right, yeah, people just went at it. They didn't even wait for the green light go. All right, so we have collapse of low skill, low knowledge labor, yeah, loss of skill, farming out intelligence, data stealing, the lost ability of critical thinking. Let's see, more bias built into AI and automation. Yep, huge thing around bias here. Income inequality came back again too. It's a very common theme here. Misinformation. It's also very obvious issue here. Yep, hackers being able to steal data. All caps, Gary. Yes. Who owns it? Control, surveillance. Great points. Oppression. No worries, Gary. No worries. I just loved the commitment to all caps. It really makes a statement. Great. Privacy, obviously. Yep. Awesome.
Okay. Let's think about. So that was great. Obviously, we could keep going, but we're not. We're going to stop just because we need to get to second orders. So let's go back to the top then. And what else? Like, if we follow this freedom from drudgery thing, we have more creative time and/or job growth. Like, what are some third order effects that happen? More time together. Okay.
Yeah, that's great. Better work-life balance, maybe less burnout. I think that's a huge thing. More time for social and community. Yeah, I think that fits into more time together. Self-actualization, increased human interactions, maybe at a more interpersonal level. Less divorces. That is possible. Time for homesteading. That.
Okay.
I see someone's already starting to make connections here. Increased innovation. I think it's really interesting. Reduced workplace injury. That's a cool one.
Cool. Let's talk about time saving.
Time saving. Yeah, more time for thinking.
What else? What else would happen if people had a lot of time?
More anxiety due to lack of purpose is what someone mentioned. I think that's definitely fair. The baby boom. That's also possible. More Netflix. Yeah, maybe people getting addiction to streaming services. Not that doesn't already happen, but increase that. Better health. Yeah, okay.
Cool.
Personality crisis.
Let's talk about, anybody want to talk about this support people with disabilities thing? And I thought that was an interesting one. I wouldn't have thought about that off the top. So
Yeah.
what happens if AI is better supporting people with disabilities?
Yeah, being able to support diversity, equity, and inclusion. Maybe increasing accessibility to jobs, just points of access. Kindness, that's great. Yeah, increase accessibility. More autonomy. Yeah, I think that's awesome. More autonomy is great. Autonomy and pride, I think those are tied together.
Awesome. Any third order effects you all would want to note here? So we've got kind of enhanced or greater DEI, kindness, increased access, increased autonomy. Like what else?
Yeah, I feel like one is maybe not having to distinct people with disabilities, just everyone becomes a person. People aren't held back or defined by their disability. Rob mentioned superpowers. That is a very ideal future. I would like to have superpowers.
What do superpowers connect to? Maybe increased access or autonomy?
Superpower to be autonomous and do whatever you want. Kindness is a superpower. That is true. I think increased autonomy can lead to, yeah, I think pride, someone mentioned before. I think that's really interesting.
Pride, is that? Okay, let's talk about less human error. So in a world where humans aren't making mistakes, what happens?
Less injury, someone mentioned. Yeah, less accidents, less errors. Reduced healthcare costs. Shorter work weeks. Yeah, overall less death is what people have been mentioning, which obviously would be great. Reduce cost to medical costs, insurance costs, maybe like litigation costs if lawsuits happen.
What happens in a world where AI can crank out like a bunch of like cheaper products? Like, do we wind up with like just too much stuff?
Yeah, probably. Yeah, I think just overproduction.
Yeah.
AI Amazon, nice. That's I like that.
Okay, let's do a little work on the negative side of the spectrum. So widespread unemployment, what happens next?
You know, increased unhoused population. Suicide was mentioned, so like degradation of mental health, mental well-being. UBI was mentioned. Generation born without opportunities.
Cool. How about hacking? What's going on when we have hacking and cybercrime?
We have, yeah, lower trust, information on ransom, ransomware, more surveillance.
I think like insecure financial systems, like, do you think that that leads to something like Bitcoin or cyber or crypto?
Or stonks. I don't know. I just
Stonks?
stonks. Really wanted an opportunity to say the word stonks. NFTs. Yes, that is also the new thing that's on the buzzwords for financial systems. NFTs and stonks.
AI Cold War, yeah. Who's the Cold War with?
Yeah, Chris, that would be a great question for you to answer. China, that's Russia. A lot of mostly votes for Russia at this point.
All right, people going off the grid.
All right.
Let's talk about bias. So, a world where AI is leading to increased bias. What kinds of bias? What's happening?
Racism is one. So mostly social. We also had someone mention, yeah, filters, feedback loops, accuracy.
Mm-hmm. All forms of systemic and policy reinforced badness. I don't know how to capture that as like one
You could
thing.
copy and paste it.
Just to say systemic badness. Thank you, Rob.
Is that the tagline for this? Systemic badness.
Okay. Last call on misinformation. So give me something on misinformation.
Misinformation one. Destroyed trust, more insurrections, increased deep fakes, echo chambers.
Tribalism with a Z.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I was like, wow, making it cool, huh?
That's how we roll.
That's innovation right there.
Right. Okay. This was great. So let's just zoom out here and kind of look at what we did in 10 minutes on AI. That's a pretty big wheel, I must say. So a little messy, yes, but I think again, I just want to underscore the productivity that we witness. You know, just in like 20 short minutes of working together, we've generated two, I think, pretty robust wheels that led us to some pretty interesting places. So normally when we talk about AI, we have kind of fairly familiar conversations about job loss or whatever, but I don't recall like say reduced health costs or the overproduction of goods or UBI as necessarily kind of obvious outcomes of that. And so it's really interesting to get to kind of these kind of second or third order effects that are our baby boom. Like who would think like AI leads to baby boom? That's why these things are valuable, because it allows us to really think creatively and to think orthogonal to the problem space we are working within. So if you were doing this for real in a real workshop or on a real project, you would make a bunch of these. So we're going to get to scenarios in a second. You would do at least 3 of these, 3 issues per scenario. And then you would do what we're going to do next, which is look for connective tissue between the futures wheels themselves. So let's look across these wheels. You'll notice that they were going in opposite directions. So that was probably a clue that we're going to combine them. So the next step in this process is to think about how change across different dimensions or dynamics starts to create connections. And so you might say, well, does something like homesteading connect to, baby boom, or does homesteading connect to entertainment boom, or does homesteading connect to too much stuff, or whatever? We're looking for combinations where there's some kind of synergy or some kind of causal relationship between something on the left and something on the right. And so I'm going to have Andrea give us an example, and then in the chat you can start thinking through what some other examples might be. So Andrea, as you look across these two wheels that we just made, what do you notice?
Yeah, I actually really do like homesteading. So if we could throw that in there, I think homesteading and sort of the relationship to stronger community. All right, we had someone else suggest craft renaissance to too much stuff. All right, we also had mass customization and less human error.
Mass customization and what?
Less human error. We also had someone mention more green space and better health.
What are some more kind of unusual relationships that you might?
I could do unusual, trust me. All right, what about small business boom and crypto? Is that really unusual though? Now I'm questioning myself.
Well, what
going off grid?
Yeah, what connects to small business boom on the AI side? Like what do you think it would relate to? I'm asking the crowd.
UBI was an option.
Yeah, let's do that. Okay, then one more.
What about, does anyone else want to type in the chat one that they're interested in? We had modularization and racism. Racism or reduced.
Explain to me that connection.
Yeah, Tempest, TC from the chat. It'd be awesome if you could elaborate. Particular products for particular people.
Okay.
Clarifying.
Okay. I'm going to rename that polarized products because I think racism is like a couple steps beyond that. So I just want to be specific about what we mean. Okay. So that was a good little starter. So in doing this, again, if you were doing this in a workshop, you would spend a lot more time than what we're spending today looking for relationships kind of across the wheels. So what we're looking for are areas where where the world's changing on one side starts to influence or is connected to ways in which the world is changing on the other side. Now we're going to use these relationships to generate some stories. So we're going to pick 3 of these to move over to our scenario building. So Andrea, pick 3. Give me 3 pairs.
I love homesteading. So homesteading and stronger communities for one. Maybe a second one is small business boom and UBI. Maybe the last one can be craft renaissance and too much stuff.
I think those are too similar to what we have so far.
Modularization and polarized products.
Okay.
For 300. Thank you.
Okay. So because we're doing this on the fly, I'm not going to guarantee that these are going to work. So disclaimer, well, let me explain what we're doing next. So the next part of kind of exploring futures is to craft stories about the futures in which we are working. Now, scenarios are simply brief stories about the future that we use as a team to kind of create a common dialogue, right? If we can say, my vision of the future is one where this is happening, and this is happening, we have something to talk about, and we can use that as a thought experiment to then contextualize what it is that we're working on. Now, this is also where we're going to come back and bring grocery back into it. So note that we haven't really talked about grocery yet. So the scenarios where we come full circle and we bring grocery back into kind of what we're thinking about. So the way that we do that is we pick pairs of things from the wheels, and to build a scenario, you would need at least 3 different futures wheels from which you would generate a number of these pairings, and then you'd pick the most interesting ones to create building blocks for your scenario. So we've got 3, whether they're interesting or not, I think remains to be seen, but we're going to work with them regardless. So this is what we're going to do. We're going to kind of go one at a time. We're going to say, well, okay, so a world where there's this increase in homesteading, right, is also a world where communities become stronger. And so my question is, how does daily life change in terms of grocery? So in a world where people are homesteading and people are kind of more local, like how is grocery different than it is today? Again, 10 years out. You can give me some ideas in the chat.
Yeah, Nikki, I agree with you. Being able to grow your own goods and trade with neighbors, maybe like local, small scale grocery stores now, just within a community. Seed innovation, that's interesting.
So you guys don't need me. You're quite good.
You're just a pair of hands typing at this point, John.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. Okay. So you can see that. Okay, so we've got a scenario brewing now. So it's just a building block. So we can stop now. That's good enough for now. I love the stuff. Just hold on.
Love the enthusiasm.
So this is good. So in making these building blocks, we're really just thinking about like, okay, what happens when these things kind of collide and come together? And it's interesting. So now we have a scenario that's shaping up where at least the first ingredient is this kind of return to the halcyon days of growing your own food in some new, more modern context. Interesting. So pretty big reversal from today where food is kind of big business and grocery is big business. So that's an awesome building block. So we're going to park that idea, go to the next one. Related, small and medium business boom and universal basic income. So what happens to the world of grocery and food when you have this explosion in small and medium businesses, potentially like directly as a result of people having the ability to start them because of UBI? What happens then?
Someone mentioned
Farmers markets, less
ugly
bougie grocery stores.
Uglier produce.
What other kinds of businesses, like kind of adjacent to grocery? Like, do you think that something else is happening? More totes? Maybe like, I'm also thinking about like more biking, like things like that. So you don't need to go far.
Right.
Or food deserts is a great one.
Yeah.
Awesome. More restaurants. Yeah, fewer exotic foods.
Yeah.
What about something like, the collapse of like P&G and Unilever?
Yeah. Do you have a similar relationship with them that you do with Amazon? Just want to see them die and demise?
Not me personally, but in this scenario, I could see how businesses like that
Well, Erica is with
are not
us.
going to do very well.
A death to corporate America. So
You're gonna make your own peanut butter.
I'm sure people already do that. So
Yeah. Okay, let's do the last one. So modularization and polarized products. So this one's a little bit different. So we have, I'm just gonna kind of, I think I'm gonna call this like customization more than modularization. So because I have the Miro board rights, I can just change a word regardless of whether it appeared on the other list. So I think that works better. Like the idea that the more products are customized or bespoke, the more that kind of contributes to kind of polarization in society and kind of haves and have-nots. So what is food like in this world? This one's going to be a little bit more dystopic.
I could see like the hoarding of seeds, going back to like seed innovation, like the hoarding of certain seeds from being available to certain communities. See, increased fad diets, diet hacking keeps coming up. Food becoming a social marker. Yeah, I think that's super important to note here. Black market for produce.
Yeah.
Inefficiencies in supply chain. Flood of foodie photos on Instagram. Pretty sure that already happens. Maybe that's the Seattle food culture tunnel that I live in, but.
Okay, so that's great. I want to, again, if we were doing this in a team for real, we would spend a lot more time working on these details. But these are great. So now let's think about a little bit of a story. So is this kind of overall, we've got some competing ingredients that we need to kind of think about. We've got kind of this kind of really delightful like local place up here, and we've got this kind of dystopian kind of designer food place down here. Those things might coexist in some way in this future. So maybe just as we try to put these into a story, is this a story of decline or abundance, or of both in some way?
Abundance, yeah, I would agree. Abundance. This is a world. That definitely sounded like the trailer voice for movies. Yeah, I think people have been mentioning abundance with a caveat.
So I might then say, like, however, even so, the market for designer food is booming. Celebrities and others have prescription diets that they sell to the masses. What is, yeah, so like the rural / urban divide worsens. Can't spell rural. Is there anything that is unexpected in this little story?
Expected. Mm-hmm. Yeah, most FDA oversight, food laws, or the inverse of that, the decreased ability for government regulation of food. Yeah, less oversight in general. Increased value to rural land. Yeah, so maybe the shift. There's less FDA oversight except for designer food, which is tightly regulated. The lack of safeguards leads to foodborne pandemics in some areas. Sounds great.
Thank you, Nicole. I'm just going to copy that one directly. Okay. So again, capture Rob's freshwater. Okay, so this is kind of interesting, right? So we have this scenario that we're building that has this mix of kind of things that we might consider positive outcomes and some things that we might consider negative outcomes. This happened quite naturally as a result of the kind of random selections we made, as well as kind of how we thought about it. And I think that's great, because the future is never going to be either utopian or dystopian. It's going to be some mix of things that we want to happen and some things that we don't. And so now, as we have this scenario, we can have a conversation about kind of what that means for the future. So if you're that innovation team working to think about the future of grocery, one of the things you might think about, for instance, if you're working in a large business, is, well, what is the future of our business in this world? How do we continue to kind of function in a world where these things are happening? You might also ask, well, how can we help the people that need help, as well as manage the externalities that are created in this environment? What are the things that we might do in terms of new products and services that allow us to support those outcomes? So again, if you were doing this on your own, you would spend some time developing, say, 3 or 4 different scenarios. And again, if you're doing the math, that means that you have to do at least 9 to 12 futures wheels. So it's a lot of work to do things this way. But as you can see, it allows you to generate kind of new thinking really, really quickly. As you develop scenarios, you might think about how those scenarios relate to one another and whether collectively they represent to you a complete or at least comprehensive view of what the future might hold, such that you can then, again, as a business or as a practitioner, think about your work across those different contexts. So lastly, we're going to spend just a few minutes thinking about stakeholders. So at the outset, Andrea mentioned that we are a responsible design firm. One of the tenets of responsible design is thinking about how stakeholders are impacted both by things that we make today, as well as things that we might impact or things that we might make in the future. So in terms of this future that we just identified, who are 3 stakeholders that we might want to think about? And those could be people, organizations, society at large, or the environment. So let's just quickly pick kind of 3 stakeholders. Could be an end user, okay, farmers. I'm going to call them large farmers or small farmers. Large farmers, okay.
People who eat. Yeah.
It's going to call that society at large. Truck drivers is kind of interesting. And so I deliberately chose some stakeholders at all different levels of scale, right? So when we're thinking about stakeholders, we can think about specific kinds of people, like a truck driver. We can think about groups of people or industries like large farmers or large organizations like P&G or Unilever, or we could think about society at large. So stakeholders as a concept scales from individuals all the way up to planet. So what we would do then is we would think like, well, large farmers in this scenario, what happens to them? They maybe have to shift to designer food because their business declines. And so the only thing they can do is shift to kind of producing this designer food. Or maybe they have to downsize, right? And yeah, diversify crops. They're probably not making corn and soybeans in the United States anymore. How about society at large? Like, if society is a stakeholder, what is an impact to society as a result of this future? You know, there's obviously the risk of greater polarization. I think we've seen that.
Mm-hmm.
Anything else related to kind of how society would be impacted? Again, kind of in a future where, you know, we've got this abundance story, but we also have this divide, right, between different groups. Yeah. Okay. And then finally, again, we're not going to go as deep as we might want to. Finally, what about our truck driver? Like, what is the impact to the truck driver in this scenario?
Shorter shifts and distances.
Probably is less work.
Yeah.
You know, if we were doing this again thoroughly, we might go back to that AI futures wheel and think about, like, you know, truck driving becoming automated.
Mm-hmm.
So if we were to do this, we were to think hard about what's happening to all of our stakeholders, and there will be lots of them. We would then want to think about, well, how do we manage externalities? So how do we either amplify benefits that are positive or minimize harm? So if we were trying to minimize harm or amplify benefits for large farmers, what might we do? Like, we could, you know, incentivize local business models. Like, we could help them transition to new ways of, you know, essentially engaging locally. That's an example of, like, again, something we might do. And if we're in this grocery business, like, we might play a role in that, right? We might buy our products in a certain way that helps mitigate this situation. And obviously, if we were in a position where we had specific innovations or specific new business models in mind for our grocery business, we could then ask a second question, which would be like, how do our specific activities affect these people and or stakeholders, and what might we do relative to those things? Great. Let's just really quickly talk about society at large. Anything we should do as a business to either amplify benefits or minimize harm in terms of these impacts?
Someone mentioned access.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Inclusion policies. That's interesting.
Okay. Well, this was great. I'm not going to do the last one because we're running short on time, and I want to make sure that we have an opportunity to answer questions. And so let's just zoom out real quick and, like, look at all of the work that we did in a very short amount of time. We did a ton of work. We developed 2 futures wheels. We explored a wide range of change. We wrote a very quick rapid scenario, and we thought a little bit about how that impacts different stakeholders. Hopefully you found this interesting. Hopefully it's a repeatable and scalable process that you could take back to your team and run on your own. If you're doing it on your own, I'd recommend that you do this at least over the course of, say, a half day. You need about that much time, as you could imagine, to really get into this content. But as you can see, in a half day, you could do a lot of work. And so hopefully you find that productive and helpful and inspiring. And so we have a few minutes left. Happy to answer questions, which you can pop into the Q&A.
So did you want to circle back to that question from Barb, John, about how do you decide which changes to explore in the future wheel with clients so you don't end up boiling the ocean?
Yeah, that was a great question. I think there's kind of two answers. One is that you kind of have to boil the ocean, so that as a futurist, you have to kind of look broadly across like a wide range of change. I think the simple rule of looking for changes that are at least reasonably adjacent to your problem space is one way to kind of make that ocean smaller. The other, though, is to, again, make sure that you're using the steep category to structure your inquiry so that you know that you're kind of covering everything that needs to be covered. But futures as an activity is inherently generalist, and the benefit of it is that it forces you to look broadly across a wide spectrum of change. So you don't want to, you actually kind of want to boil the ocean to some degree. Is the pairing of these signals designed or randomized? It works better if it's designed a little bit. And so again, there's a little bit of expertise that's required in kind of curating conversations like this. If you were doing this as a team, you would probably want to spend some time prioritizing changes in terms of what you think are most relevant to the work that you are doing. How do you make this a dynamic process that becomes internalized in the company and not just a one and done workshop? Great question. Probably you should hire some reliable consultants to work with you on a regular basis to make sure you're constantly refreshing your perspective. But besides that kind of slightly jokey answer, I would just say that it's a matter of continuing to do it. I think my own experience is that once you start doing this, once you start looking for change, it's kind of hard to stop. And most people who have been through this process find the scenarios very useful. The process just gains momentum the more that people, again, adopt them in their daily conversations within an organization. When you do this exercise with clients, are there any preparation exercises to get them in a creative or visioning mindset? I think we just did that. The beauty of the futures wheels is that, if you give people permission to, just kind of get into it and have fun, my experience is that most people, just like we did today, are capable of generating a wide variety of outcomes. And also just making sure that people have permission to kind of do, suggest ridiculous things. So there's no kind of wrong answer in a futures wheel. And I think the more you create that kind of inclusive and participatory environment, the better off everyone will be. Do you ever take these exercises to do with actual direct or indirect stakeholders to get concepts from within the particular space? Interesting question. So yeah, so you could, let's say down the line, we're on this grocery innovation team, we've got some concepts. The kind of proper way of doing it, if you were truly engaged in a participatory process, would be to essentially engage the community you're designing for and with in the creation of the futures, as well as the kind of application of them. That's actually a really important point. So it's not something that's done in isolation in an ivory tower. It's something that is truly an augment to the human-centered design and participatory design process.
So I do have some questions in the chat as well, John. So I want to make sure that folks in there have a chance to get answers.
Yes, let me answer Jelly's question, what would be the best final presentation state in a pitch for board or management? What would your MVP be? So if you go through this process, and I think the best thing to do is to point you to existing scenarios online and or speculative design sources online. So what you would do is you would try to find a way to make the scenarios tangible, either by doing something like creating artifacts from the future, or creating some kind of experiential way of engaging with the futures in such a way that sort of non-participatory stakeholders could kind of get into the space and really understand it. If that's something that you're interested in with me, kind of DM with me offline. I've got a lot of resources.
So we did have a question from the chat that asks, what is the most creative way you've seen this exercise applied in the real world solution or in a real world solution?
Wow. I don't know if I have a great answer for that one. Because I can't give you a client-based answer, which would be kind of my go-to, because I've worked with clients who have taken work from processes like this and essentially instituted kind of innovation programs or new business models based on some of this work. Now, again, this is a long-term future. So, to answer that question for real, I'd have to say, well, 10 years ago, I did a program and we decided this, and then this happened. And that kind of happens that way, but I think that futures is not quite so linear. It's more a question of continuing to update our own kind of mental models with respect to how we think about change in the present, more than it is, kind of looking 10 years out and saying like, well, were we right about something? I think that there have been cases where, for instance, we've worked in spaces like augmented reality, where some early work on thinking about externalities ultimately became key ingredients in designing responsibly much later. But it's rarely a one-to-one. It's more that we're getting a little bit better each time by virtue of, again, exercising these muscles. What else, Andrea? Are there other questions that I can't quite watch the chat because it's moving a little fast?
Yeah, no worries. Someone asked, I guess this question got a double tap, but you kind of touched on this a little bit, but what happens when you've helped a client prepare for a future scenario that isn't realized, or perhaps a vastly different future unfolds?
Yeah, I mean, you change your scenario is the easy answer to that question. Because as I said, futurists don't make predictions. So our job is to kind of think creatively about the future and to provide a canvas for making better decisions. So if we've created, say, a set of 3 or 4 scenarios, our goal isn't to make sure one of those comes true. Our goal is actually just to provide a canvas for thinking, such that if our kind of fictitious grocery store is thinking about, should we be investing in, hydroponics, for example, local hydroponics maybe is something they're considering. Should we do that? Well, we could look across the various scenarios and probably answer that question, or at the very least, provide a more informed perspective about how to answer it. And so that's really what we're trying to do with this kind of work. There's another kind of work called visioning work, which is an augment to this. We don't have time to get into this, but you could also take a step beyond what we've shared today and create a vision for a preferred future, and then think about what you have to do to work toward it. But that's for another webinar and another day.
All right, we are almost at time. Wanted to once again take everyone or thank everyone for taking the time for joining us today in your evening or your morning or our afternoon. Super appreciate all of your participation. It was really awesome to be able to have this collaborative experience. Once again, as a reminder, we will be sending out the recording for this session, the materials and the worksheet that we just walked through. So y'all will be able to have this in your own hands and be able to take a first stab at strategic foresight. So thank you all so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you, everybody.